Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review Fright Night 1985, I guess I have to call it, because ultimately there was a remake. Technically, there have been four Fright Night movies, if ultimately people did not know, because there was Fright Night 2, there was Fright Night the remake, and then there was Fright Night 2, which ultimately technically just like Fright Night 2, with the exception of just like a younger Brewster and evil, and like it's kind of like a foreign film where ultimately a kid is to head overseas and eventually end up with like in the second one, of course, in the original second one, we end up having a tour. It's uh, a female vampire, which in uh, Fright Night 2, the other one, it's kind of the same thing. Like it doesn't drastically change but it's not really a sequel movie. Really, it's not like they tied the first one in. They kind of just reboot the whole thing within the sequel one, which is kind of just a bizarrish approach. It really is. But anyways, so four Fright Nights, isn't that great? So going on into here, so I really enjoy this movie because I think it's a movie where you really don't actually do any lick of any of this stuff anymore when really looking at it. Because I think this movie has a lot to do with like Brewster being a very nosy neighbor, which I don't think people ever really do that anymore. I think a lot of the times, unless your like neighbor is really banging a bang, like consistently, or like your neighbor plays a lot of loud parties late at night, I just don't think you care about your neighbors anymore. Like I think it's just like, meh, they live there, I live here, whatever. Like there's sometimes where ultimately, of course, I live in a townhouse where it's like basically like it's like two houses connected together. So it's a lot of times if like a neighbor is just consistently just like banging away just 24 hours, then ultimately you're just like, oh my god, like it's just. But anyways, we end up having it to a reasonably. Within this movie, we have it to where, of course, this Fright Night is basically about vampires. In Fright Night 2, the original Fright Night, we end up kind of having, like, kind of skipping around and having it be, like it's kind of like it's vampire, but it's also a werewolf, but also could quite possibly be a Frankensteinish like character and all kinds of things. There's kind of mixtures of stuff in the second one. Um, could be interesting. But anyways, so going on to this first one, it's kind of an interesting concept. It's like you really don't see this anymore because I've seen movies like Disturbia or the Tom Hanks movie The Burbs, and it kind of feels like that, where we ultimately have a nosy neighbor that ends up getting his uh, nose kind of into somebody's business way too far, and it ends up basically almost blowing up in his face. I kind of like the fact that eventually Brewster ends up going into the shrubbery, and eventually we have it to where Jerry, who is the vampire, ends up kind of noticing him and ends up like tossing an apple right in front of his face, and we end up having it to where Charlie ends up running off. Eventually, bizarrely, the one moment that ultimately will understand is like, okay, how is it that a vampire eats an apple? Well, evidently, there's, I believe, maggots in the apple because ultimately the apple is so rotted and so whatever that ultimately it's just filled with maggots and whatever. That's ultimately the part that the vampire is actually eating. So, going into this, I thought that this was like there's something interesting about here. I liked the effects. Ultimately, I thought there was a lot of effects going on in this movie, and I think a lot of the effects took a really long time to do. Like we have it to where at some point that a person is transforming from a wolf to back to a person, and I'm like, holy crap! This effect is taking a while. Man, has it taken a long time. We ultimately have at one moment where there's a giant bat that is flying around, and good God, is that effect kind of gruesome looking. Um, but I thought that was like a really fun effect to see that being done. Ultimately, at some point, we also have a person that eventually is going to seemingly decompose, which ultimately I was like, God dang, that's a long stretch of effect. I was like, look at my watch going at this effect. So, anyways, I like this movie. I like the whole fact of like somebody who is basically a horror fan has to realize that he is in a horror like he's in a horror movie basically. We end up having it to where forcibly we end up as per usual having a person that is a fan of horror movies, but then also when looking at it, he doesn't know a lick of anything about vampires. That is the stupidest thing. Why is it that we have to have a person who is a fan of horror movies but doesn't know how to take them all out? Every single person would tell you, chop off head, everything dies. I don't get it anymore. I don't get the consensus of, like, okay, well, I have to figure out every single weakness that this thing has. I have to find out garlic. I have to figure out holy water. I have to carve up a wooden stake. No, get an axe, chop off head, and you're done. Ultimately, you could have it to where you can like repetitiously just start like chopping off like parts of the body and whatever, but then eventually chop off that head and it's donezo. Like, and ultimately, I know a lot of times a lot of people would just say it's like, well, like it's probably easier to just go for the chest, to go for the heart and whatever. Like, I don't know how many times you would probably ultimately like not hit the right place of where the freaking heart is. Because a lot of people would just be like center mass or whatever, just go right there in the middle. When ultimately you'd be like, well, should I go here? Should I go here? Like, where should I go? And like I remember the one, um, the Buffy movie where we end up having it to where Sutherland's character is telling Buffy that she hit the wrong spot, and so on and so forth. And then Pee Wee Herman's like, ooh. That movie is hilarious. I think eventually I'm gonna have to revisit that movie and watch it just for the like it's hilarious. So going into here, uh, I like this movie. I think it's fun. I think it's a fun movie. It ultimately goes into the approach of just being a fun movie. Where can you watch this movie? Where ultimately it is free, because ultimately everywhere else you would have to pay a certain fee. If you're looking for a streaming source, if ultimately you're not going to just buy this movie right out and just because it's probably going to be cheap anyways. You could probably go through Movie Pro. I would ultimately probably adjust some of the settings once you get into the video part, because ultimately you might have to go through a different server, because that's what I ended up having to do. So I could watch the movie, because bizarrely the video wasn't working in the certain video part. But anyways, that was a way I could watch this movie for free. I think I have a copy of this. I think I have a copy of this movie, so ultimately I could have just watched that. But ultimately, again, I always look for a streaming equivalent before ultimately going in and just popping in the DVD and Blu-ray or whatever, because I have every single one of these Fright Nights. So, because I really enjoy them. But anyways, let's go into that delicious double fived time and go out of our way to say that we've seen this film because it's I like the whole like movie or the monster vision kind of concept. We end up having to where Peter Vincent is a guy that is otherwise turning around and pulling an Elvira after being a vampirish woman being placed in other movies. She went and did like a variety show where it's like, hey, here's a monster movie. There you go. So let's end up going and cranking out this review. So let's let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we need to spoil this movie. So, in the very beginning of this, we end up having it to where Charlie and Amy are going at it. We end up having, and the funniest thing is, they're going at it on the floor of Charlie's room. Like, what? The bed wasn't good enough for these people? They had to go on the floor and just mac out? So, Charlie ends up lifting up Amy's shirt because he's getting really bizarrely turned on by horror movies. Sure. And so we end up having it to where Amy's like, not tonight, Charlie. And Charlie's like, come on, Amy. We've been dating for almost a year now. Come on. Give me some of that. Give me some of that, Amy. Give me some of that. So we end up having it to where bizarrely Charlie is hearing sounds from his neighbor instead of hearing what Amy's response is about give me some of that. Give me some of that slice. And so Amy ends up like... so we end up finding out that supposedly it seems that Jerry and his man, his right-hand man, his other guy, his dude, I'm assessing it's probably maybe Billy Cole, I would assess. Anyways, so Jerry and his day man, I'll call him, ultimately are putting a coffin into his home, and we end up having Charlie going like, what the heck is going on over there? Are they seriously bringing a coffin into their home? That's a little weird. And we end up having like Amy going like, huh? And so ultimately we end up having it to where Charlie is just so confused by someone bringing a coffin into the house that ultimately he is just like consistently going and trying to watch his neighbors. Every window that is at his house, he's trying to poke out to ultimately see if his neighbors are doing something. So we end up having it to where Amy ends up getting frustrated and just starts to walk out. We end up having it to where Charlie's mother is ultimately hearing the commotion of whatever they're talking about. And so we have it to where Charlie's mom, Brewster's mom, ultimately is going in and like talking about like, well, hey, if you guys are having relationship troubles, what a classic mom move. That ultimately you just gotta bug in and butt in, and like a lot of times a lot of these like moms in these movies have to go in and try to like solve everybody's problems, but really it just sounds weird. Like why would this mom care so much about like, she's like, hey guys, whatever you're doing, just as long as you're just not gonna burn the house down kind of thing. So we end up having it to where so Brewster is poking his head out the window, and ultimately Brewster's mother is ultimately just saying like, hey, why don't you like follow your girl out to the door kind of thing. And I'm like, what a weird kind of concept of this dating whole thing where you gotta walk a girl out to the door or whatever. Anyways, so we end up having it to where Amy ends up saying, well, I'm going to leave for the night. Goodbye, Charlie. Goodbye, Charlie's mom. And so ultimately we have to where, like, Charlie's mom says goodbye and Charlie's just glued to the window. And so Amy ends up leaving. So we eventually have it to where eventually we have it seemingly where evil ultimately is to mention like, oh, are you guys having a relationship problems? Like, oh, is it too bad that ultimately you guys like couldn't get it on kind of thing? Whatever. Like, we have it to where evil is just a douchebag. But eventually we have it to where Amy confronts Charlie about it the next day, and ultimately they kind of make amends about it all. So we end up having it to where eventually Charlie is to go and have binoculars now because he wants to know what's going on at his neighbor's house every second of every minute. Having binoculars out to go and check out what his neighbors are doing is the weirdest effing thing. So we end up having it to where here's the topless moment of this whole entire movie. So we end up having it to where Jerry evidently brings home a woman that ultimately is a little bit of a lady of the night, and so we eventually have it to where seemingly out of Charlie's window, we end up finding a woman that is ultimately giving herself to Jerry, and so Jerry ends up going and showing little teeth to this girl to otherwise tell us that he is going to probably kill this woman. And so eventually we end up having it to where Charlie ends up seeing with his binoculars. And so Jerry ultimately sees him and he's like, like I'm gonna put my window curtain down because I'm gonna do that. So you can't see that I'm gonna kill this person. So eventually we have it to where seemingly we end up having it to where Charlie is gonna naturally assume that he is going to be dead soon because when looking at it, is like, dude, I'm probably gonna die because like I have a vampire next to my house. We end up having it to where reasonably, uh, Charlie ends up going to Evil and saying, "Dude, I have a vampire next door. What am I gonna do?" Evil ends up running down the list of stuff that he can do, like, hey buddy, get garlic. Hey buddy, get holy water. A basically everything else but wooden stakes, bizarrely. So, and ultimately we end up having to where Evil tells Charlie, like, hey man, whatever you do, don't let the vampire invite himself in. And surefire enough, we end up having it to where uh, Charlie is ending up being told by his mother that, hey, we have new neighbors who came in. It seems like one of the men is like really attractive, and so we end up having it to where Charlie ends up going home, and seemingly we find out that Brewster's mother had invited the vampire into their home. Because ultimately we have it to where Charlie had bizarrely just thought, oh yeah, I'll be able to just nail my window shut and I should probably be fine, right? I'll just nail my window shut and everything will be perfectly okay. No. If any monster movie will tell you that, is to never just nail your window shut, because ultimately they'll just come through, I don't know, some other place besides the window? You think? Plus, this vampire is really strong in any number of things. So, but anyway, so we end up having it to where ultimately, because what ends up happening is that we are to assess that Jerry had killed this woman and ultimately had his day man dispose of the body. Charlie went out to ultimately check on Jerry, and we eventually have it to where Charlie's mother is shouting for him outside the bushes, and we eventually have it to where Jerry ends up noticing Charlie, and Charlie ends up running back into the house, which ultimately alludes to them eventually going and Jerry inviting himself into this home, and then eventually Jerry inviting himself into Charlie's room, ultimately to choke him out and to basically say it's like, hey Charlie, don't scream because ultimately, like, I don't want to have to go and kill your mother. We ultimately have it to where seemingly Charlie goes and ultimately goes and gets across, but we end up having it to where uh, Jerry says it's like, well, you have to believe in it. Like, why would you tell the secret of why would you tell the secret of the cross to anybody? Like, dude, you could just go ahead and kill him. But anyway, so we end up having it to where, since Charlie did the cross maneuver, we end up having it to where Jerry ends up uh, opening the window to where ultimately it's going to have it to where like Charlie is going to get stabbed with the nails on the window. So and we end up seemingly having it to where Jerry ends up grabbing any last minute thing that he could possibly grab. And so he ends up grabbing a pencil and he ends up jabbing the pencil into the vampire's hand. And we end up having it to where the vampire's like, oh, you have messed with the wrong hombre. But eventually we have it to where seemingly Charlie's mother ends up kind of waking up and like going like, hey Charlie, my window is jammed. So we end up having it to where Jerry is kind of basically telling Charlie, it's like, oh, this is not done. We're not over. This is not over between you and I. Because eventually we have it to where Charlie ends up calling the police on Jerry, and ultimately the police just kind of calls this kid crazy. And so, like, Charlie, like, calling the police on this guy isn't going to work because no one's going to believe him. It's going to be the boy who cried wolf. So eventually we have it to where ultimately, so Jerry ends up going and rescuing his mother from a stuck door, and Jerry ends up leaving from some other window. So we end up having it to where Charlie turns to the only person that would probably maybe quite possibly believe him, and that ultimately is Peter Vincent. I guess luckily we have it to where seemingly Charlie is in the same state where Peter Vincent is otherwise to be uh, doing his Fright Night show. So we end up having it to where supposedly Charlie is asking Peter if he believes in vampires, and ultimately Peter says yes. We end up finding out that Peter had been fired from his job and let go. We end up having it to where Charlie said, like, oh yeah, like I've been watching your show and everything like that. And ultimately, like Peter Vincent is like, oh, well, yeah, that's great. But I wish that there would have been a lot more people watching our show because it would have kept us alive. So we end up having it to where Charlie ends up confessing to Peter that ultimately he's like, hey, like I have a legitimate vampire next door to me. Like, please help me. We end up having it to where Peter is like, no, there's no way. There's like, come on. Like, you're nuts. Like, I'm going to go. I'm going to leave. So we end up having it to where Charlie is full-fledgedly going on into having like he's going to war. Like he basically configured and changed his whole room around to carve up some wooden stakes, have garlic all over the place, and all kinds of things. Like we end up having it to where Amy and Evil are going to Charlie's room and they're like, whoa, somebody's changed some stuff up. Okay, what's going on here, buddy? So we end up having it to where Charlie is mentioning that he is going to go over to Jerry's house and go to kill him before before reasonably uh, Jerry comes for him. So we end up having it to where ultimately Evil and Amy, in desperation, end up going to Peter Vincent to ultimately pay him off to help convince Charlie that Jerry isn't a vampire. So here's probably the best scene in this movie coming up soon. So we end up having it to where ultimately Peter is to call Jerry to ultimately have him test uh, test that he isn't a vampire to Charlie. So we end up having it to where they end up asking, it's like, well, hey, would you touch a cross to ultimately solve that you're not a vampire? And Jerry says, like, well, no, I'm a very religious person. Like, he's trying to curve around any number of these solutions that ultimately they have for him. Ultimately, we have it to where Peter says, is like, well, hey, how about you just drink what is to be holy water? It isn't actually going to be holy water. It's going to be tap water. And Jerry's like, okay, sure, fine. Like, that sounds like a good solution. even though reasonably it's like it could have been death for Jerry if he went along with it. So we end up having it to where Peter is to go to Charlie and say, "Hey, Charlie, like I'm here to take down this vampire." And we ultimately have it to where Charlie has none of his equipment. He's just going in with a batch of holy water, and that's about it. And Charlie's ultimately saying, like, "No, you have to have your equipment. He's a real vampire, believe me." So, because Amy and Evil went into Peter, ultimately convinced that ultimately uh, having Peter convince Charlie that Jerry's not a vampire would like ultimately be saving a man's life. So we end up having it to where Peter ends up going in and giving Jerry the what is to be the fake holy water. Jerry ends up drinking it, and ultimately you have it to where I think a lot of times Peter was really just uneasy with Jerry and his dayman, and so ultimately we have it to where Peter ends up getting like a cigarette out of this like cigarette case or something like that, or he ends up kind of just fixing himself or whatever with this case that he had that ultimately has a mirror on it, and so eventually we find out that seemingly Peter is looking for Jerry's reflection in this case, and ultimately we find out that this guy has no reflection. And so ultimately Peter is convinced that oh crap, this is actually a vampire, and like I am effing scared. So I'm gonna well said I was gonna sneeze, but ultimately I was like I'm gonna sneeze. So going on here. So ultimately, we have it to where Peter is ultimately just like, yeah, this is all the proof that I need, but ultimately is like kind of really scrambling out the door. We end up having it to where Peter ultimately tells Charlie, it's like, okay, you are right. He is a legitimate vampire. Okay, sure, I believe you now. And so we end up having it to where Peter isn't going to do nothing about it. He's just going to like freaking count his blessings and move on. We ultimately have it to where seemingly that Jerry is to realize that ultimately it seemed that Peter had broken his mirror case, and ultimately we have it to where Jerry ends up realizing that okay, the jig is up. So we end up having it to where Charlie is supposedly walking all of his friends home. Ultimately, we have it to where supposedly Evil is just kind of tired about hearing all this about this vampire stuff. He's calling Charlie a loon and everything like that. So we eventually have it to where Evil plays a trick on Charlie to ultimately pretend that he had gotten bitten. Oh no, Charlie, I had gotten bitten. You know what that means now. You have to kill me, Charlie. So we end up having it to where Evil plays this trick, but that is eventually to have Evil separated from the pack. So we eventually have it to where Evil ends up going out of his way to walk on his own, to eventually to be followed by Jerry, and then eventually to be having Jerry turn evil at some point. So we end up having it to where Amy and Charlie are making their way to getting the F out of here, to where we can have Amy go home. And of course, we end up having it to where ultimately Jerry ends up following Amy and Charlie. So they end up deciding to end up going and going into this, I think, club to just ultimately just be safe, to be in a place with public. And so, excuse me. So Jerry ends up going into this club and eventually ends up separating Amy from Charlie, and eventually it seems that Amy quickly but surely goes into a trance of sorts, and ultimately seems to be like connected with Jerry, to where ultimately like Jerry could basically make her do anything that he wanted. And so eventually we have it to where Charlie tries to uh, kind of like grab on to Jerry, and eventually we have it to where there's security that gets into the way, and we eventually have it to where Jerry ends up going like, "Hey man, like I want it, like I want it, I want to, like I wanted to talk to Charlie some more." Because ultimately we have it to where Jerry ends up grabbing the hand of Charlie and squeezing the life out of it, and we end up having these security guards break this up, but eventually we have it to where Jerry ends up slicing with his fingernails one of the guards. And so we end up having it to where eventually Jerry and Amy leave. And so ultimately we have it to where Jerry had told Charlie that he wants him and Peter back at his house because ultimately, like, they're going to fight it out. So ultimately, we have it to where Jerry ends up going back to his home to ultimately go and bite Amy. So we end up having it to where Charlie is forcing Peter to come back with him to this house. Peter is otherwise telling Charlie the whole truth about ultimately he was paid to come and try to prove that this guy was a vampire. And ultimately, we have to where Peter Vincent is really just mentioning how much of a coward he really is. So, but we end up having it to where Charlie ends up convincing Peter to come, and but Peter is just terrified. We end up having it to where Peter ends up getting a couple things of equipment to ultimately say it's like, okay, well, maybe we'll just be able to shoot seemingly Jerry's Dayman and with a normal gun, and that should be fine. And then ultimately we'll be able to just kind of take Jerry out through normal means with a cross and just stabbing the crap out of him, I guess, with a stake. But ultimately, we end up finding out that it seems like there are some things that ultimately these guys don't know about, which is ultimately evil turning into being, of course, really and legitimately evil. So, because what ends up happening is that ultimately evil ends up going to Peter's home, because recently we end up having it to where Charlie ends up talking to Peter, and ultimately he talks about how he's a sham, but then eventually we have it to where evil ends up going and attacking Peter, and so Peter ends up putting a cross onto evil's forehead, and so we end up having it to where forcibly Peter has to grow a pair, let's just say, and ultimately go into Charlie's home to ultimately go and slay these vampires, because when we're really looking at it, it's either Peter dies by himself or ultimately he dies with Charlie, which ultimately it's a numbers game. So we end up having it to ultimately, so we go in here, and so there's consistently this like separation of sorts. So we end up going on here, and so we end up having it to where they go into the house, and ultimately we have it to where seemingly Jerry is to try to use, or Peter ends up using his cross on Jerry, and ultimately Jerry has to throw in the fact that it's like, well, you have to believe in it. That's the only way it's going to work. So he crushes the cross with his hands. So we end up having it to where reasonably that Charlie believes in his cross, and so ultimately Jerry ends up going, oh no, like don't hit me with that. And then we end up having Jerry's Dayman ultimately batting away uh, seemingly Charlie, and so ultimately we have it to where Peter, with the terrifying belief of just like, well, like Charlie's down, like, dude, I'm freaking booking out of here. So we end up having it to where Peter ends up going out of the house to ultimately go to Charlie's home, where ultimately he will find evil yet again. So we end up having it to where Charlie is to be grabbed and thrown into the room that ultimately Amy is in, and Jerry throws a stake and ultimately says, like, it's either you or her, so what are you going to do? Because ultimately she's turned, and ultimately eventually at some point we're going to have it seemingly that it's either kill or be turned. So we end up having it to where Peter ends up going to Brewster's home, ultimately going and trying to see if he could call someone, but ultimately finds out the line is dead. So he ends up going into finding Brewster's mother, who is to believe to be sleeping, and we end up finding out that it's evil, actually, in a bizarrish looking Raggedy Ann like wig. So we end up finding out that Evil had cut the phone lines, and ultimately Evil had also had it to where Brewster's mother is, I guess, working late, and ultimately she had made food for him because food's in the oven. So we end up having it to where Peter ends up running out of the room because he's terrified of Evil, and then Evil bizarrely turns into a wolf and bizarrely tries to lunge at Peter, and we end up having it to where Peter ends up, out of fear, ends up breaking this coffee table of sorts that was by this hallway, and eventually he ends up taking one of the broken legs and ends up stabbing this wolf in the heart, which ultimately this wolf ends up falling over this stairwell and ultimately ends up like dragging itself to a portion of this uh, underneath this stairwell to ultimately realize it's going to die, or evil is going to die. So we have it to where slowly but surely this transforming wolf man into back to person, we end up having this really slow burn where Peter Vincent is ultimately just like, oh, like I can't believe I'm gonna watch a person die, and I feel so bad for this guy, and this and that, and we ultimately have it to our evil. It's just like, I'm gonna die. This sucks. Too bad for me. So we end up having it to where after this courageous moment that Peter is ultimately just convinced that he's like, well, like I can't just leave Charlie by himself. I need to help him. Like ultimately, like Charlie gave Peter his confidence back, and so ultimately we have it to where Peter is going to go back and face his fear. So we end up having it to where Peter ends up going back to ultimately burst open the door of Charlie's room that he's stuck in, and so ultimately we have it to where Jerry is realizing that ultimately Peter and Charlie are in this room. We end up having it to where ultimately they end up having to lock this door back up again so Amy doesn't get out and try to kill anybody. Because we ultimately have it to where seemingly uh, Jerry ultimately tries to go after uh, Charlie and Peter, but he ends up failing. At some point, he ends up turning into a bat and ultimately tries to get at them, but ultimately that is all really for naught. Eventually, we have it to where Jerry ends up going onto the roof at some point and calling for Amy to help him, and the whole him turning into the bat thing comes off a little bit later. So, to the whole rooftop moment. So, we end up having it to where reasonably. So, we end up having it to where, like, Jerry and Peter and Charlie are fighting it out for so long. We end up having it to where Peter ends up shooting down Jerry's day man, and but he ends up getting back up. And so ultimately they kept shooting and shooting and shooting, and then ultimately they end up just putting a stake in this guy's heart, and eventually this guy bizarrely just starts to melt away, bizarrely. And then that's when ultimately Jerry ends up calling for Amy to help him because he's on the roof, and then Amy doesn't go for the call, and then eventually we have it to where Jerry comes back to try to fight them off, and ultimately we eventually find out that it's close to daytime. We end up having it to where seemingly the sun is rising. We end up having it to where Jerry ends up turning into a bat, and ultimately, eventually, we have it to where Peter is fighting off this bat, and eventually, we end up having it to where Jerry pushes the bat into the sunlight. And ultimately, Charlie ends up getting like the bat to bite him in the arm. So we end up having it to where ultimately, so we end up having it to where the bat ends up flying into the basement. So we end up having it to where also Amy is making her way down to the basement to ultimately try and take off or take out either Charlie or Peter. So because Charlie and Peter to make their way into this basement to ultimately go after Jerry, because they have to kill Jerry or otherwise Amy won't, or Amy will end up being a vampire forever. So we end up having, excuse me, we end up having it to where ultimately they go down to this basement and ultimately they are haggling with Amy. Like, man, there's a lot of times where I just see people just crashing through stuff in this. I'm just like, hopefully nobody got injured in this movie. That would have sucked. To ultimately just have like so very few action moments where ultimately people are just kind of like crashing through things and falling over and things and maybe getting hurt. Who knows? But anyways, we end up having a tour eventually. Uh, so Jerry is to go into his coffin, I guess, naturally assuming that he'll be safe in his coffin. We end up having it to where Peter ends up trying to like chisel or whatever the coffin pieces, so ultimately he can get into Jerry's coffin. So we end up having it to where Peter ends up reopening Jerry's coffin. I'm like, wouldn't have Jerry just gone in the basement? Wouldn't that? Why did he go in the coffin? That seems bizarre. So we end up having it to where Jerry goes into his coffin. Amy is trying to attack people, but nothing's really working. So we end up having it to where Peter ends up going and stabbing Jerry supposedly in the heart. We end up having it to where bizarrely that uh, there is so many things being flung around at this point. We end up having it to where ultimately Charlie ends up going and taking some items and chucking them into windows to ultimately just try and otherwise try to get sunlight more into this room. So we end up having it to ultimately Jerry is to get stake in the heart, but eventually we end up finding it to where ultimately all these windows are being opened to where eventually Jerry is to get too much sunlight in here, and eventually he turns into being a dead vampire because ultimately there's too much sunlight in this room. So eventually we have it to where ultimately Jerry is dead. Ultimately, Charlie and Amy go back to ultimately watching Peter Vincent on Fright Night, and ultimately they are yet again making out in their bed instead of on the floor, bizarrely, to end this movie. So ultimately, with the exclusion of there being quite possibly something going on with Jerry's neighbors, because ultimately there's some red eyes that are going into Jerry's home, ultimately to allude that quite possibly evil is still alive, bizarrely. Uh, but yeah, so we end up having it to where ultimately Charlie is to hear a noise from his neighbors, but he doesn't think anything of it. Just goes back and starts making out with his girlfriend, and ultimately watches Peter Vincent's Fright Night. And so that's the way the movie just ends. So, anyways, yeah, it was an interesting movie. I liked Fright Night. I liked the original Fright Night. It's just a fun movie. So, anyways, I think I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.